recorded a song this week entitled "Tell Me the Story of Your Life," a song that I wrote. And when I send out the email this week, I'll include the YouTube video. And
good.
It's actually got kind of a little sing-along portion. Write your story down. Write your story up. Anyway, it's kind of fun. All right, so this week we're going to talk about writing your spiritual biography, which we haven't specifically talked about. However, I don't know, as the Holy Book says, to a spiritual man, all things are spiritual. So it'd be, in a way, kind of hard to not cover your spiritual development in an autobiography if there is some spiritual growth. If there isn't, then might be a good time to start that. But so, scientists tell us that every cell in our body, the DNA is pre-wired for two things: for growth and for integration into the whole body. And to me, that's sort of a metaphor of spiritual growth as well. In other words, spiritual growth should go on in our individual life, and it should be something that at some point in our life we awaken to the fact that there's more to life than just flesh and blood, you might say. There's spirit and soul. So that revelation may come as a child, it may come as a teenager, it may come as an adult, having children, walking in nature, and suddenly it strikes you the amazing connectedness of everything. It can come in a lot of different ways. It can come on your deathbed, which, as one of my favorite authors calls, enlightenment at gunpoint. So at some point in our life, we will awaken. And my question, I guess, to those who balk at it or say, I'm a purely secular person, I'm an atheist, I'm an agnostic, I don't need spirituality. I would say, well, I don't have that much faith to believe that everything just happened by accident. There's a famous apologist, or one who defends faith, that said the likelihood of us coming together spontaneously would be like a tornado blowing through a junkyard and assembling a 747. And those are the odds. Now, some people can believe that could happen. I'm not one of them. I don't have that much faith. To me, design in creation speaks of a designer and a creator. And so, whatever your concept of God, though, whether you want to call it Jesus, Buddha, the universe, the ground of being, there's many different names and many different paths spiritually. But anyway, this DNA that's within us is calling us to maturity, both individually and as an integrated part of a larger body. Just if you think about ourselves and our bodies, they don't function independently. They're part of, our whole organism. And so, that being the case, as we mature, we should be growing and evolving and moving forward. And so, one of my favorite authors, again, as I mentioned, was Kathleen Singh. So today I want to talk a little about one of her books entitled The Grace in Living, and I want to sort of overlap that with Ken Wilbur's book and sort of template that he's come up with on the 4 stages of growth, which again, Kathleen Singh lays out 4 major steps in spiritual growth as well. So I thought, since they're both 4-step plans, why not see how much they overlap and what it might be able to speak to us. And so that's kind of what I want to cover today.
I like a 4-step program better than a 12-step program.
Yeah, really, let's cut to the
That's
chase,
good.
you know.
Now we're at 8. And
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Now, there are many psychologists that have identified, say, anywhere from 6 to 9 levels of consciousness that have distinct transition points that can be, you know. So, we could discuss all 8 or 9, but I like simplifying as much, and so I think this does a good job. And in our book, The Story of Your Life, there's a section by discussing what Kathleen Singh had to say about the grace in dying, and it's, I think, toward the back, because, oh yeah, it is. It's like under week 8 on ego building youth. If you can go to week 8. Let's start with that, and then we'll go into this. So, because what we're talking about, is a cycle of life that she also identifies 4 stages in dying. So 4 stages in spiritual growth, 4 stages in dying, and probably in a lot of different parts of our life. But our earliest experience as an infant is a magical time of connection with both our mother as well as our Creator, or as some call it, the ground of being. The state of divine union reflects our original goodness, purity, and total surrender. It is this luminosity that is perceived and experienced in the presence of a newborn infant, which parents witness at this earliest stage of self, which evokes love. So I think any mother can relate with that, and even fathers, that when you gaze into your newborn's eyes, man, you're looking at about the closest you're ever going to see to the eyes of God. Because that child is still very, very connected to its source, God, love, the universe. And so it's not, as it were, sullied with a troubled mind or,
Challenge.
baggage. I mean, they're baggage free when they come in, right? So it's only their interaction with adults that starts adding baggage along the way. But okay, so at birth we begin, and in this state of purity, we begin, though, at a certain stage to begin to build our ego. And at our death, or as a result of spiritual practices, we let go of our ego. So our ego is something that's going to be with us for many years, and so learning about it, understanding it, and how to, how it functions is can be helpful. As we grow, the ego moves toward increasing differentiation, a dawning sense of me, as Kathleen puts it in The Grace of Dying. This developing of consciousness of the child establishes the first dualism between self and non-self. Very relevant, because it also represents the final letting go in the dying process. So that's just what a strong grip that our ego has. It's the very last boundary that is erased in the dying process. We hang on to our perception of our illusion of being separate and being our own self right up until the very end. Now, we can loosen that grip through spiritual practices ahead of time, but it's this dawning sense that I am not my mom that the child goes through that is the first dualism. So we started off with a unitive, we are one with the world, with our mother, with everything, and that's where we start, very whole, a holy person, you might say, a whole person. But then we start to get fragmented. The first fragmentation is that, well, I'm not really the same as my mom, I'm apart from my mom. And it's easy to believe that because we're looking at somebody separate from us. So why would we think that we're still one with them when in fact we see something different? So that's the first dualism. And it launches us, as she says, into a lifetime journey of ego building. In other words, wow, I guess I've got to be special in some way. How am I special? What makes me special? And so it also spawns the concept of time and space. You notice that a newborn has no concept of time and space. I mean, they are oblivious to it all. So anyway, this first dualism launches then into a series of additional dualisms. We begin to make distinctions between the past, the present, and the future, which births, as she calls it, the second dualism, which is the distinction between life and death. So children start to notice at a certain point, maybe around 4, 5, 6, whatever, that that bug is alive and that one's dead. That dog is barking and that one got run over in the middle of the street. How did that happen, Mommy? Where did they go? All those questions about the difference between life and death. So this is the second dualism, which develops in early childhood, and it seeks to begin to divide and separate everything. And thus we get into the habit throughout our whole life of dividing good, bad, up, down, alive, dead, etc. And our thoughts and our feelings begin to separate as well. And this wholeness that we had that came in unquestioning of love that we came is now under serious question. In other words, the world which began as a totally safe place is now looking more and more dangerous as we begin to be more perceptive of it. And this is not wrong or unusual. This is a part of growing up, but it does have a downside. So the next dualism, the third dualism, is between our mind and our body. And this usually happens in middle childhood years. And, the body goes through changes. And the mind, we start thinking. According to Singh, the loss is immense. We lose our deep integrity, the unity of body and mind, which is the unity of feeling and intention, the ability to be present. So how far does it go back to us being preoccupied with the future or, dwelling on and, stewing over the past? It goes all the way back to probably middle childhood years. So, thus our ability to be present is further fragmented with this third dualism. And that is, as she says, an immense loss. The fourth dualism is our persona, that is our false self, the division between our acceptable self-image and our shadow self, which most people define our shadow self as that part of us that we cannot see or that we disown. The part that we're kind of blind to. It's the part that's like, we can't see our own head because, well, our eyes are pointing that way. So we're blind to a lot of us, of what is us. Our personal consciousness believes its apparent independence and self-control. In our early childhood, adulthood years, we become lost in our own dramas. We forget our original nature and goodness, right, Singh? So this fourth dualism is pretty well entrenched by young adulthood. And oftentimes it stays entrenched until almost the very end, because it's so believable that, or unbelievable that, that we could have a dark self, but we don't want to see it. Now, oftentimes, a spouse will help point out things like that to us and we get mad at them about it, or our kids will point it out to us, or our parents, or other people, and we can either believe it or not. But what I found interesting about this understanding of these four dualisms is that that the healthy ego building of the first half of life is followed by a healthy ego decline in the second half of life. Elders are able to see the full circle of life from a much broader perspective than youngers can, because, well, they're still in the first half of life. They don't have any experience of this, of a further journey. That to them, the journey is all about ego building, about upward mobility. Who am I going to be? How do I get to be a VIP? How do I get more followers? How do I do this and that? And they're all, they're wanting to know and know. But at a certain point, as we talked about with Roar, we hit a falling, and that falling causes us to reevaluate everything. And then once we do that, we set ourselves up for some true progress in our growth. And what she would argue is the dismantling of these four dualisms, gradually going backward down the wheel. So the first thing we would do is recognize we have a shadow self and start to deal with it. That would be our first step. Next would be bringing ourselves into a mindfulness and being present in the moment rather than stuck in the past or the future, which we all fall into. It's very tempting. Then we would begin to understand that there's really not, that life, that death is a part of life. It's not separate from death. So we begin to heal that and not fear death. We begin to be, like the Apostle Paul said, "Oh, death, where is your sting?" There's no sting if you understand that death is part of life and that it's all good. It's not going to be a scary place that is tormenting anyone when you really understand it. Then the final divide, or the final step, is that first dualism, the understanding that I am not. It's an illusion that I am separate from you, from the universe. We're all part of one thing. Just like if you could see underground, we'd see all the roots of these trees interconnected underground. It's below the surface. So once we can see how interconnected we really are, then it's a lot easier to fulfill that second part of the great commandment: love God with all your heart. A lot of people are pretty good at that. It's the loving our neighbor as ourselves. That's where the rub is. And then the further one of loving your enemy, that's where most people say that's only something Jesus could do. Or, some great enlightened soul loving your enemy. But how do you get to that point? Well, it's because you begin to see that you are not separate from your enemy. Your enemy may think it, and they may attack you left and right, but you can be in a different place of consciousness and understand that, that you can still love them even though they may spit at you or whatever. So that's a pretty high level of consciousness, but it's something to attain to. And Jesus said it was entirely possible. So with that as a preface, let's go on to this spiritual, writing out your spiritual journal and biography and including it into your autobiography. Again,
Before you start there on the fourth dualism.
Mm-hmm.
What age do you think that might be at? You said for the first one 6, or the second one 13 to 15.
Mm-hmm.
The fourth, is it just from young adult to death?
I think it could start, the fourth dualism, seeing your shadow self. There are many people who consider themselves spiritual who never address their shadow self. It goes for their whole life. Some people, through spiritual practices in meditative prayer, begin to have a sort of spirit of repentance in their life, and they see that the areas that they've been blind to. I don't know if I mentioned the story of Henry Nouwen, an author who wrote a book on the prodigal son. And he talked about he saw himself as the prodigal who ran off and ultimately got reconciled with the father. But his friends said, "Oh no, you're much more like the older brother who is so full of himself, so thinking himself holy, that he got mad when his brother was accepted by the father." That was spiritual pride. So a lot of times it's hard for us to see that. We think we've attained something, and then boom, somebody points out to us that we're not as holy as we might think ourselves. And then we go, "Oh wow, me?" And that's what happened to him. He had an aha moment when somebody told him about the shadow of himself that he did not know he was leaving, so to speak, or being perceived as. So I think it can happen at any time. There's not an age thing on it. You can actually move into the second half of life as a teenager or young adult, if you go through some kind of a falling that causes you to awaken. And there's different things, and that's what we're going to talk about in her book, The Grace in Living. The subtitle is Recognize It, Trust It, and Abide in It. And what is it? Well, we'll talk about that. But so Kathleen Singh has, I say, done the universe a great favor to explain the value of writing our own spiritual awakening biography. This is regardless of whether you do your whole autobiography or just want to do one specifically on this, which she defines as our movement into being beyond the self. And so you could say that the autobiography is about yourself. The spiritual biography is about your being, or being present in the moment. And that doesn't always happen chronologically. It can happen very different. She says there are two important questions to ask at what she identifies as 4 stages or 4 quarters of spiritual development. And I'll give you those in a second. But the 2 questions are, what is prompting you to turn toward awakening, being, and liberation? So what is it that is awakening you? What's behind that? And secondly, what inclines you to fall back into the limitation of self and survival mode? And so she says that all 4 stages, those 2 key questions would be helpful to reflect on. She describes spiritual development or evolution as being divided into 4 quarters on a chronological timeline. So, and these 4 quarters could start at any point in life. They could start as a child, they could old age, nearing death, anywhere in between. Each stage may be of different duration for every person, with the second stage, she says, often being the most time. So just quickly to give you the 4 stages that she identifies, the first one is moving from tasting spiritual awakening to hungering for spiritual growth. So, you know, the scripture says, taste and see the Lord is good. That's what I think of when I think of tasting. Yeah, just take a little taste of it and go, that's good. You may not keep gorging yourself with whatever it was that tasted good, but you got a taste of it and you thought, I'm remembering that, that's good. And so that's the first step, is to move from tasting to hungering. This is what, and similar overlapping with Ken Wilbur in, and I guess the book that goes into it in more detail is entitled The Coming Waves. And Ken is one of the contributors in, it's got several authors, The Coming Waves. But he identifies the first quarter as waking up. So, you know, again, so she says tasting to hungering, that's waking up. And in a nutshell, he says waking up is when we have this desire, this heartfelt desire to return home, to return to the glorious abode of ultimate reality. The second would be, now that you've moved from tasting it to hungering, to move from seeking spiritual growth to what she calls the end of seeking, which I thought was quite interesting, because I was thinking, do we really ever end our seeking of God? I mean, you know, to me it's almost like written in the continuous verb, seek and keep seeking. You know, like in the Bible it says knock, but that word knock is knock and keep on knocking, and you know, the door will be open for you. So you don't just knock once and then give up or stop, you keep knocking. So we'll go over that, but to her the second quarter is from seeking spiritual growth to the end of seeking. So there's some kind of a conclusion to your seeking, or at least a chapter of it, that you're content with where you've sought to become spiritual, and now you're happy with your path. And this is the second stage is what Ken Wilbur calls growing up. So you got waking up, growing up. The third stage, third quarter, we move, according to Kathleen, from spiritual healing. So that's what's going on in the second stage of moving from growth to the end of seeking, is that there's some serious spiritual healing going on that then moves us into spiritual maturity. This is the stage that Ken refers to as cleaning up. And it's marked by a growing detachment from ego growth. And while our individuality is grasped, but it's not elevated among other expressions of the sacred. Okay, and then the fourth, again, I'm giving you a quick overview and then we'll go into more detail. The fourth quarter is to move into ripening, according to Kathleen, and enlightenment and servanthood. So this is where we are not claiming that we've arrived anywhere yet necessarily, but we're spending more of our time as a ripened person rather than a maturing person or an unripe, person. So this is what he refers to as showing up. In the ripening stage, we literally become nobody special, and that's, I think of the book by Ram Dass entitled Becoming Nobody, and nobody special, that is. In other words, we're all very special in some ways, but very ordinary in other ways. We begin to experience greater dimensions of love, compassion, joy, and liberation. So this is the full cycle, from tasting to seeking to healing to ripening. And so let's go into it in a little more detail. And I must apologize that if you're looking at this saying, this seems a little out of order. What happened was page 2 is 3. It should have been over here. So as you read the bottom of this.
I got lost.
Yeah, I'm sorry. My photocopy bad. When I post it online for anybody watching this, it will be correct. So anyway. Let me just read the introduction to the section 2 by Ken Wilbur. In this time of spiritual growth and awakening, it's helpful to have a framework that can orient our practice and our progress. For this purpose, a few years ago, Ken Wilbur introduced a frame into his integral lexicon. He's known in philosophical circles as the development of integral theory, which sees the interconnectedness of everything. His best-selling book is entitled A Short History of Everything. So only somebody of either a fool or a genius would even attempt to fulfill that title of that book. You know what I mean? But he does in it, and it's a book for me, I read very slowly, and I need to go back through it again because it's talks about quantum theory and a lot of different things. He brings together a lot of disciplines. But the bottom line with Ken Wilbur is that he is a great asset in the spiritual community because he has brought together spirit and matter and explained how they're interconnected in a way that science is now confirming. So there's no argument. It's a straw man argument that everything isn't spiritual among those who take time to research it. So he came up with this wake up, grow up, clean up, show up. And I think in another version he says open up as the last stage. Show up or open up, being similar, give back, in other words, show up and do something. This simple frame has gone viral and many teachers and students have benefited from its use. So we're not talking about something that is just a little idea. It's something that has been circulating and gained quite a bit of traction. Okay, so going to Kathleen's first quarter, this moving from spiritual awakening to hungry. So what's involved in that? I'm not just going to go through these bullet points. The first quarter involves short glimpses beyond our small self. Reaching out for the beyond often arises when we cry out for help. The first quarter ends when the longing becomes too strong to remain silent any longer, spiritual desire becomes a priority in our life. Does that ring a bell with anyone? There was a certain point in our life where I just have to study more about this and learn more about this. For me, it happened when I was about 18. Some people might be, in a midlife crisis. Some people, as a young kid might start seeing this and looking into it. And then the rest of us along the line of different points in our life. But when our spiritual desire becomes a priority, that's when we, have started the waking up process. The first quarter is spent developing a healthy identity, ego, self, and learning to survive. However, later we discover our ego mistakenly sees itself as separate from others and from the sacred. This is held even in a lot of faith communities, that the sacred is out there, right? And not in here. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the tenets, of course, that I like with unity, which is that God is active in everything and everywhere. I'm just looking up on the wall here. I'm naturally good because God's divinity is in me. So this is a step of maturity to see God as being in us, not just out there. That doesn't mean that God can't be working out there, but it's not a different God or a bigger God, or it's the same. It's the one God. It is a sense of incompleteness that is at the heart of our yearning for the soul to be heard. So when when we come to that awakening, aha moment, that we yearn for our soul to be completed, that's what moves us into spiritual growth. We seek ways to let go of our known way of being, allowing grace to move us to higher ground. The path leading to the first quarter of spirituality may begin as a child, being awestruck in nature, being affected in mind, body, or soul. It may be a sense of connection when we take moments to pause during our normal events. Glimpses of unbounded love also give us a heightened compassion toward others and ourselves. It might be that we see a person in great pain, or in a crippled position, that suddenly this wells up this compassion for this person, and we shift our consciousness gets a shift, moving us wanting to understand it. This moving from tasting to hungering could be initiated by music, which is sometimes referred to as the original language of the soul. So it could be that you hear a piece by Bach, or heaven forbid, a heavy metal song that moves you to awakening. It could happen, in any way, in any kind of music. I think sometimes the chants, the Gregorian chants and that kind of thing, can be very spiritual. The Hindu chants can be, something as simple as Nameho Renke Yo, or however you say it. I'm not saying it right.
Nam-myoho Renge Yo.
Okay.
Drove my dad crazy with that one.
Yeah. So whatever it is that moves you there, wonderful. It's like all roads lead to the same. It may be a childhood memory of playing by the ocean, feeling like at some point, you're going to dissolve into and become a part of that ocean. It may be while reading a book or hearing somebody speak, and your soul asks, what is real? I know there's something more than I see right now. And so writing your spiritual biography would be reflecting on this. Now, to help you with that, she has come up with a series of questions that's on page 2 down at the bottom. First quarter prompting questions. So in this sheet that I handed out, in the book, there are 155 prompting questions, of which there are probably about 10 that deal with spiritual things. But here's an additional 50 or 60 in this sheet here for each stage that could help you identify. For example, under first quarter prompting questions, look down toward after show up. where it says first quarter prompting questions. What are your deepest moments of understanding or vastness? What were your concepts of yourself? What are your ideas about the sacred? What is the nature of your relationship with others? What were the moments you felt wounded? What conclusions did you come to about yourself and the world? What were your challenges? What gave you strength? What beneficial qualities did you develop? And so on. What are the legacies from your family? When did spiritual hunger begin to awaken in you? So, using these, you could pick a few of these and write on these as subjects. So she gives you plenty to choose from, dealing with how did it first start in the first quarter of your spiritual growth. Reading what Ken has to say about this first quarter under waking up, over here on the third page. When consciousness of it or not, all members of humanity have a heart desire to, or whether conscious of it or not, all humanity has a heart desire to return home, to return to the glorious abode of ultimate reality. So we may not realize it, but there's a homesickness built into us. Home being unified with God. All human beings have an intrinsic desire to know the single, indivisible, great sphere of love from which, into which, and as which all existence shines forth. He's known for complex, long sentences, but that gives you an idea that all human beings have this desire to wake up. It may be shrouded and covered under a bunch of worries of this world, which Jesus used the example as like the thorns, the seed that falls in the thorns of this world and the concerns cause it to not grow. But that seed is there in everyone. And within the context of integral theory, waking up relates to various stages of consciousness. As one awakens, one's exclusive identification with the superficial layers of reality are dismantled. One moves beyond an exclusive identification with thought to the non-dual base of awareness, a base that naturally and spontaneously manifests as all relative form. Waking up to this base awareness is fundamental to the new civilization that is emerging on Earth. Waking up to this single sphere, always already perfect, exactly as it is, must be our prominent priority. So that's very articulate way of putting it, that this waking up process is not necessarily seeing something new. It's seeing something as it always has been, but we just didn't have eyes to see it. And that's why I think Jesus could say things like, you have eyes, but you do not see. Okay, you think you're awake, but you're really sleepwalking. I mean, he may not have said that exactly like that, but the point is, this is this first stage of just saying, whoo, there's much more out there than just, eating and drinking and being merry. As fun as those things are, there's more to life than that. And so this non-dual, this unitive field is available to everyone. And I think it's interesting that he says this is fundamental to the new civilization now emerging on Earth. So talk about a big global movement. And this is happening spontaneously worldwide. And so that makes us feel like we're a part of something much, much bigger. And it's something that is divinely happening right in our time here in 2023. How about that? So it's nice to be a part of an awakening movement. And as she points out, this moving from tasting to hungering is very important, but that's not all. Step 2 in Kathleen's is to move from seeking to the end of seeking. So what does she mean by that? So she says the second quarter begins when we actually seek a path out of ourself and of suffering. So until a lot of people are quite content with themselves. I mean, let's face it, they got it going good, and it's me. I'm good. I'm all good. Why would I seek anything more? I mean, it's all good the way it is. Until something happens, then it may change. But there's a longing to escape the purposelessness and alienation that we've come to experience in life. So this longing and seeing disappointment, which is sadly what it takes often to feel like we need to go on, it may begin with teachers, books, groups that resonate, that we hear about this longing to discern the truth. It could happen in a lot of ways. Exploring our spiritual biography, we discern that, and I like that she calls this central casting. I thought that was good. God or the universe, whatever you want to call it, has sent us many teachers along the way in the form of mentors, friends. This third one is interesting. Difficult people, serious sorrow, or depressions. We become seekers, yet we still deeply believe in ourself and our ego. I particularly like this because she's pointing out that what we may not think of as teachers, that person that just rubs us the wrong way, that God actually sent them to us for a purpose, to help us wake up, that they're actually there specifically for that reason, and that rather than reacting to them, we need to embrace that. Difficult people. Serious sorrow or depressions, our whole culture teaches us to avoid those at all lengths. And yet she's saying, no, embrace them. Like Rumi says in his book about the guest house, when somebody comes in and steals all your furniture, don't be mad at them. They may be cleaning it all up for something brand new that's even better. That's not that easy to do when all your stuff is gone overnight.
That reminds me of Stephen Wright. He did a comedy. He said, I left my house and I found out my furniture was stolen and they replaced it with all the same furniture when I got home. I thought that was, made me think of that.
So this second quarter is where we start to learn how to embrace bad stuff and want to escape the purposelessness of it. And the second quarter, it might be months, years, decades, or for some a lifetime, and it can be painful. This can be kind of the dark night of the soul of us facing up to certain things that are painful, but healing is essential to growth in the second quarter. So somehow we need to come up with some spiritual solutions to help us with this suffering and to heal us. At some point we feel insufficient for the self-survival mode. The second quarter is marked by expanded attention beyond mere survival and requires letting go of anything the self thinks that it can achieve on its own spirituality. Ding, 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 ding. That's where a lot of people kind of are stuck because we think that we can achieve what we want in ourself. And that's the very antithesis of true spirituality, where we're letting go. And the self is not the solution. The self is part of the problem. Sort of like I've seen the problem and it's me, I'm coming to that realization. Liberation follows intention aligned with grace. That's a great sentence. Liberation that we all seek to be free follows intention. So we must make it our intention that we want to grow, that is aligned with grace. And grace, of course, is the unmerited gift. So we don't earn liberation. We have an intention. We're aligned with the gift of it from God. And then we end up at a point of liberation. Surrender, this is a great line. Surrender is a tumble into undefendedness. I recently read a book entitled Undefended Love. It's another word for unconditional love. It simply means that most of us have spent our life putting shields up around us. And they're to protect us. We need, if they're healthy. We don't want to be hurt. We've been hurt before. We want to be protected. We want to have a little buffer. But the truth is that true intimacy in a relationship with God or with a spouse or a friend comes when we let those shields melt away and fall down and we become real. And so what she's saying here is that surrender is tumbling into undefendedness. And that does not come easy. It takes some time to develop. How do we lower these walls? There's certain tools and steps we can take. The second quarter ends when we see through the illusion of seeking the fantasy of forever seeking and searching. I had to read that a couple of times. So she says that it's an illusion and a fantasy that we need to continually, perpetually, forevermore until the day we die, keep seeking nirvana or seeking enlightenment. The truth is, we've already got it all. All we need to do is recognize it and, allow it to do its work within us. And so as we begin to give up and surrender even our seeking, then, and she says this begins intermittently and then grows steadily. So we don't do this overnight. We go through like a season of seeking, and then we should follow it with a season of reflection about what we've accomplished or where we are that's different. And that's the value of writing our spiritual autobiography, is that we can step back and see, wow, I'm not the person I used to be a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I react to things differently now. I'm more, slow to react to things that would be hurtful, where I immediately used to just react to stuff. I've learned to become less reactionary. Surrendering is frightening to the ego, she says, because the self has no footing beyond itself. I had to think about that for a minute. But it's just like, think of it in terms of at death. The ego cannot even imagine, according to Freud, a world in which it does not exist. Even when we're faced with our own mortality on our deathbed, we still somehow think that the ego will survive as a spectator and watch this whole thing happening. But it never dies, because if it dies, who am I? What am I? And so surrendering is frightening to the ego because the self can't define itself without the ego. It's like a circle. So, okay, let's see. Okay, so that's kind of all she had to say on this movement from seeking to the end of seeking, and what Ken calls it as the growing up stage. She says, waking up is the true nature of reality, is only part of our duty. So he considers waking up to be a duty, but it's only part of it. The single abode of awareness, intrinsically good by its very nature, shines forth and is refracted through manifold aspects of itself. Okay, he's sort of complicating things a little here, but he's saying that there are many aspects or elements or aspects of your awakened awareness. This refraction of perfect light forms seemingly individual constellations of consciousness. We commonly call these relative vortexes of consciousness selves. So there are many aspects to our self that need dealing with, I think is what he's saying. We give them names, social status, and roles. In integral circles, again, this integral theory that he's the founder of, We even say that each self has 4 quadrants with various degrees of developmental capacity and the whole matrix of qualities. Each unique expression deserves our recognition. Each unique expression deserves dignity and respect. Everything you are and everything you do either enhances or dampens the potential of reality to express itself through you as you for the benefit of the whole. The more we grow up through varying structures of consciousness, the more perspectives we can take, the more complexity we can hold, the more care that we release in the world. A commitment to growing up in all dimensions of life becomes a sacred vow one takes to allow reality to incarnate through us to the fullest degree possible. Okay, so growing up means very much what it says, that this ability to hold different perspectives. I think of it like being able to hold paradoxes. You hold one truth, but then there's another truth that's maybe equally true in different circumstances. So, like Paul said, when I was a child, I thought and spoke as a child. Everything was either right or wrong, light or dark, up or down. But as I matured, I began to see that there can be 2 sides of an argument. It can be a paradox. So as we mature spiritually, what I see him saying here is this potential of seeing that everything deserves dignity and respect and recognition. And so we begin to be less judgmental, we begin to be more inclusive, less exclusive. So this is a process that happens during this growing up phase, that we begin to see all dimensions of life and or more dimensions of life anyway. Who can see all dimensions? But and it becomes a sacred vow that we want to allow reality to incarnate itself through us. So it's not just Christ that was God incarnated, it's all of us. We all are incarnations of God, but we don't act like it. And we're not aware of it, and we're asleep in a lot of it. And so in this growing up stage, so some of the questions that she came up with in the second, there are actually a gazillion of them that are laid out here. And they are, believe it or not, starts on the back page and goes to the second page because of my copy mistake. What turned you towards spirit, and what is it that turns you back toward your separate sense of self? So those are the 2 essential questions she says to ask at all stages of life. When did you first reach out to find a spiritual path? What instigated the path of active searching? And then this huge list on page 2, she has the most questions during this stage. What teachers or teachings resonated with you? What shift occurred in your response? What were your thoughts about your goal? What healing did you find necessary in order to continue your spiritual path? How did you tend to the healing needed? What shift occurred in your sense of self this healing has occurred? What church challenges have you faced in your practices? What has changed in your emotional reactivity? By the way, it may be, when it says church challenges have you faced, I don't know if you've ever been in a place where you're maybe growing at a little different rate than the leader of the church is preaching about, and you're kind of moving beyond some of that, and at some point you may be faced with the reality that this isn't really the church you should be involved with. You may want to sit down with a pastor. But the thing is, you're never going to move. People move at their level of consciousness according to sort of an internal clock within them. I don't think you can accelerate it for other people. You could try, but it maybe end up very alienating and frustrating, such as if you try to do the same with a spouse or a loved one. In fact, Richard Rohr says that when you're trying to choose a mate, try to find somebody that's within one level or two at the most of spiritual development of where you are. If you think you're going to take them from a very basic view, that is survival mode of just, it's all about me and my body and how I look, and very, you might say, shallow things, to a deep spiritual thing, you know, you're setting yourself up for disappointment and frustration. And, you know, it may be that maybe you're up for it, but rather than, you know, then there's also the possibility that person may drag you down to their level. So you know, you're best off finding someone that's also at least on a spiritual journey and acknowledges it. Some people aren't, and if you try to push them toward it, they're just going to go like that. So in any case, but when I read that about, you know, your church, what challenges did you face in your church? I thought of that. But when I started back in the 90s, awakening to not all of this, but just the inclusiveness of the kingdom of God, okay, and began to listen to teachers that were teaching in terms of understanding the kingdom of God, because it is what Jesus spoke on more than any other single subject in the Bible, was the kingdom of God. And yet it's understood, most people push it off into some future event that happens when we die and we go to the kingdom of God. And yet Christ talked about it in present terms, as though the kingdom of God is within you. It's in the present moment. So when you start talking like that to people who are looking for it only in the future, they start saying, well, that doesn't sound right. That's not what I heard from, you know, I heard, you know, when I read that, I'm thinking this happens all when Jesus returns and we all go to heaven, etc. So I sense this happened to me in, you know, seeing that you can begin to move into new understandings that sometimes your fellow believers or fellow church members aren't at. So it's good to find a place where you're content. What has changed in your emotional reactivity? So this is where I mentioned, you know, I used to be very reactive when I came across things that didn't fit right into my understanding. So I would react to it. And but as we are becoming more spiritual, we, I think, should become less reactive, more reflective, and not lashing out, because we don't have anything to protect. We're not protecting a sacred doctrine, etc. What are your practices during the second quarter, and what was your experience of it? What was your spiritual goal initially, and how has it shifted? What were your disappointments about your goals and outcomes? What did you learn from these disappointments? So there's this huge questions.
Learning curve.
Huh? Yeah.
Learning curves.
Well, they're prompting questions that you could find a few would be excellent writing points. What was the turning point for you to surrender? Well, if you haven't surrendered, then there is no turning point, but it gets you to stop and think about it. So, second quarter, moving then into the third quarter, we move from spiritual healing, so there's healing going on in the second quarter, into spiritual maturity. And again, this is what he refers to as cleaning up. But what Kathleen has to say is the third quarter is marked by a growing detachment from ego growth. Individuality is grasped but not elevated among other expressions of the sacred. So you begin to let go of comparing yourself, dividing, detaching yourself from upward mobility being the ultimate goal of life, which is what ego is about. You might say you stop thinking of yourself as a VIP and are just content the way you are. The ego's operating system of survival mode remains available to function in daily life, but we trust it only to help us navigate in the world and our interactions. We begin to operate, that is, to be driven by a different operating system, which would be divine love. So we exchange the ego's system of always wanting to better itself or seeing itself as better, to being driven by divine love. This is when we're whole, we're now at a place, or as we begin to be whole, we're at a better place to begin to be mature and express divine love in more and more circumstances. The self is no longer seen as our soul or even our primary operating system, nor as a reliable refuge. So we begin to distrust the senses, the self, and what the world is telling us to do. I think Jesus said it well when he said, we're in the world, but we're not of the world. Okay? And that is, I think, a major step of maturity. He said, I'm in you, the Father's in me, and I'm in you. And the goal is that, that you demonstrate to the world the superiority of the kingdom of God, the superiority of being ruled by the Spirit. That's the kind of unity that people can discern and they respond to it. Rather than the, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, the world's way of looking at things. In being mode, we come to know the awakened state of grace and how to put grace into action. So, we come into this being mode through sometimes meditation, sometimes through a lot of different prayer, reflection, but getting into being rather than always being absent. In other words, being and present could be the same. Being in a present mode, we come to know an awakened state of grace and how to put it in action. We learn to allow, which becomes a familiar response. We're all going to face some suffering as we age, but our response allows us to graciously embrace it. Has anybody ever heard aging people do nothing but complain about aging?
Right.
I mean, it's hard not to, because you're experiencing things that you never did, aches and pains and health issues and stuff. But and that's why coming into spiritual maturity while we age makes it a lot easier, because it's fighting this this sense of allowing what's happening and embracing it as all good instead of cursing it. Makes it easier to respond and to be around, frankly, to be around people who are embracing their aging process is much more, much more enjoyable. We have a clear-eyed discernment about what makes us and what serves us and what no longer serves us. Decisions are made with increasing wisdom, as both the self and the seeker diminish, presence arises. So this presence that we all agree is an admirable place to be, present in the moment, rather than worried about the past, worried about the future, or stuck in the past. It arises as the self shrinks. I must become, what Paul said, I become less as he becomes more. It's saying the same thing. And being willing to let go of the things that don't serve us. To me, that can be symbolized with as simple as becoming more of a minimalist, clearing out your closets, clearing out your storage room with all kinds of stuff that you never use. Put it back into the flow of the universe. Give it away, sell it, do something with it. Don't just let it sit there on the off chance that after 5 years you may need it again or something. There's a balance to that, but that's what I see as In other words, to create something new, you've got to get rid of something that's existing to make room for it. And so this cleaning up, third stage, according to Ken, involves, in a similar way, the more integrated each of us is, the more whole, psychologically healthy we are, the less dusty is the glass in our stained glass window of life. So I like that image. I mean, we all have a stained glass window of life. We're all supposed to be the light of the world, but that can get kind of dusty, can get kind of clouded over. The less dusty our window, the more brightly the light of reality can shine. This means we all have to be responsible to clean up anything that might be clouding our transmission. If the process of growing up helps to provide more tools for our toolkit of life, cleaning up gives us more refined skills and more potential energy for how we actually use those skills. So once we're healed, we're now in a better place to be able to be a vessel of healing for other people. If we're walking around wounded, gaping wounds gushing all over the place, we're in not a very good place to be able to help others. So I like that he puts this, that it gives us more potential energy in how we actually use those tools. So all of these processes are moving us toward how do we become doers of the word, not just hearers and that kind of thing. So cleaning up is actually putting things into practice. In fact, at a certain point in practice, we no longer do psychological work for our own benefit. Okay, a lot of people go see shrinks to help them get a grip on themselves. What he's saying is doing psychological work is not just about you. It's about you being able to serve others, which is an ultimate benefit and an ultimate higher calling than just fixing yourself. You do have to do work on yourself, but it's like one preacher said, if you don't have a so that, so what? Okay, so there are a lot of people perpetually and forever working on themselves, but they never get done and never put it into gear. It's like a car in neutral. It's got the power and it can go, but it's not. Rather, because we know that a reality can touch more people through us, the cleaner we are, we clean up to be of deeper service. Cleaning up shadows and integrating all related dimensions of self shows us to purify the signal from the source, allows us, to purify the signal from the source as it broadcasts out to the world. So, just like, the difference between listening to an old scratched up record with all kinds of other sounds in it and a pure digital sound, or even a pure non-digital without the distractions. That's what I think of when he says cleaning up the crackles in our life that make it distracting from the source. We want, when people to see us, to see God within us as we mature. We don't care if they, are impressed with us, because the less of us there is, the better. The more that they just see the God within us, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the goal. That becomes the goal. The ego likes to take credit and say, well, my spiritual walk is really showing some fruit these days. Have you noticed it here? Take a look. Let me tell you. No, a spiritual person, you can't deny that they're fruitful, because everywhere they go, there's a sweetness, there's an acceptance and a willingness to embrace, because you're an embracing, loving person. So this is what I think of when I think of this cleaning up process, that it involves some work, involves going through a dark night of the soul, but the benefit is that people see the light within you and within everyone. Every person, whether they are saved or not, has the light of God within them. It's just that it's kind of dim because of a lot of dust and clouds that have gone over the lens. But so this process of cleaning up in the third stage, and then she has not that many questions for the third stage. Actually, just the bulk of them were in the second. The third stage questions would include: what inclined you to move deeply into awakening? What drew you back into the separate sense of self? So again, these are these reoccurring questions that at every stage should be asked. What healing was necessary in your life that moved you into this? How have you reduced the distance between your realization and the embodiment of it in everyday life? I thought that was good. You know,
Yeah, that is.
that's a very good point, because you could say that the distance between our realizing that we are still functioning out of the self versus a higher self, the distance in that time should shrink as we mature, to where some people, enlightened people, live in a place of really perpetual awakening in which their self doesn't even show itself much. It may, nobody's perfect, but we can see this embodiment of awakening clearer in our life, and we can see progress in it. What has been changing in the nature of your practice? Is anything? Are you doing, what kind of spiritual practices? Is anything changing? Are you noticing that it's more difficult or easier to forgive people, to spend time in silent meditation, in prayer, etc.? Is there something changing? What shifts in your understanding of the spiritual path or of the awakening of self? So during this third quarter, as we're cleaning up, there should be some visible changes that you can document, and writing them out will be helpful to be able to stand back and say, I am not back at the first stage. I'm making progress, and that encourages us to move on to the fourth stage, which she refers to as, if I can find it in my stupid laying out of this paper. Okay, the fourth quarter is what she refers to as ripening, enlightenment, and servanthood. So these are all another ways of saying you begin to, the ripening stage, we literally become nobody special. We begin to experience greater dimensions of love, compassion, joy, and liberation. In other words, we wake up on the right side of the bed almost every day. Right? We deeply appreciate our commonality, and our individuality comes out to play. I love that. Individuality coming out to play. I think of that as Jesus said, we become childlike. We have a beginner's mind. We don't think we know it all. We know that we don't know it all, and we're comfortable with that. And so our individuality comes out to play, because we realize that we're all created as amazing expressions of God, and in that appreciation of the commonality, we become curious to find out about another person, and it's more about them than it is talking about ourselves. Trust permeates us. The call of the self is heard mindfully, but it is much less seductive. So we begin to, the voice of the self becomes less and less influential in our life. As we ripen, we come to fruition, as the word ripen indicates. I mean, I love biting into a ripe piece of fruit. It's sweet, it's fulfilling, and it's as it should be. But, like I have some pears at home that aren't ripe, and they're pretty boring before they sweeten up, We become illuminated and inclusive, not separated. We begin to see the unity of matter and spirit, of ourself and others, and we know ourself as embodied grace. So we begin to see, and I've heard it defined that a mystic is one who sees things in wholes rather than in parts. And so as we have this experience of enlightenment, of ripening, we've gone through the healing, we're becoming spiritually mature, etc. We begin to see that there's no division in much of anything. Kathleen has created a wonderful list of about 60 prompting questions to help us write out our spiritual biography and to complete a spiritual timeline. So you can incorporate this into your autobiography. You can do it as a separate thing, just your spiritual. I don't think there's any way, as I said in the beginning, to extract it from your life if it's a part of your life. So in my autobiography, which I don't have it here, there are probably, of the 50 chapters, no less than 10 or 15 of them that talk about my spiritual walk, because it's been such a part of my life at all stages. Well, starting at about age 20, so that's been, like the first or the last 2/3 of my life, let's put it that way, or more than that, 3/4 of my life. So in the fourth quarter, Ken calls it the showing up.
Restroom break, feedback.
Oh yeah, no problem. So finally, just for the sake of this, I'm going to keep going. Finally, all of this, whether we speak of waking up, growing up, cleaning up, is used in service of the whole. The entire frame is just a skillful way to catalyze your maximum potential to show up in all of your glory as a true emanation of the source. As we move beyond individual paradigms of isolation and separation, humanity will more fully discover the power and potential of shared, unified intention. When, with this understanding at heart, and with each of us exemplifying a unique expression of intrinsic unity, we can together rain down blessings on the earth that we have come here to give. May this be an invitation and an activation of all that is necessary for us to show up together as a single unified force of reality, and that we truly are. Wake up, grow up, clean up, show up. And all of these concepts are explored in more detail in a book with Ken Wilbur entitled The Coming Waves. So, like I said, it's all about, as she said, servanthood, becoming to a place of being able to benefit everyone, as well as ourselves, growing and coming to our own maturity. We are, as that DNA, responsible to be a part of this entire body called the universe as it's growing up, and find our place of service in it. And that's one of the things that in the Bible it talks about, the body of Christ. That there are different members. Some people have a gift of this and a gift of that, but we need all of the gifts to be a whole. We can't just all be a finger or a toe or a mouthpiece. We need all the different parts functioning together, and that's what showing up means. Her final fourth quarter questions include: what inclined you to move deeply into being? What can pull you back into the reactivity of the separate self? Have you had times that you felt that this is it, that you've reached a point of enlightenment? Are there moments that you have that? How long do they last? Are you still working toward that, or you think that you've to some degree achieved that? What did you learn? What is your practice now? How do you offer it to the world? And what are you grateful for? So, She suggests choosing from these list of 60 or so questions for reflection, meditation, and response in putting together your spiritual biography. So, I think we've covered enough for today. More than enough.